essence with the Western legal tradition and societal norms, and that the political and supremacist character given to it by contemporary Islamic jihadists is an extraneous and non-essential element of Islam that can safely and fully be excised from Muslim communities in Europe and the US, which will then take their place alongside other faith communities within the existing social contract. So, where and when exactly does Islamism, or more precisely political Islam, originate? Many ascribe it to Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, in his establishment of the Brotherhood itself in 1928, and his formulation of Islamic theology and law that was later crystallized by Sayyid Qutb in his writings in the 1950s and 60s. Al-Banna and Qutb, along with their Pakistani counterpart Sayyid Abu Allah Maududi, presented their view of Islam as a recovery of the traditional and true Islam in its fullness as essentially a political movement, as a political movement at its very core. They saw the Brotherhood as an effort to restore elements of Islam that, for a variety of reasons, had fallen by the wayside, and particularly the political character of Islam itself that had decayed during the period of the decline of the Ottoman Empire and was destroyed altogether when Kemal Ataturk abolished the Caliphate in 1924. Now, those events and the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood certainly are watershed moments in the history of political Islam. But can they actually be said to be the origin of political Islam itself, and thus can be separated out from Islam itself, leaving a religion that is perfectly compatible with the role that religions have historically played in the West and play today? Now, this is, I hope everyone understands, a very crucial question to ask. It is very important to understand the relative relationship between Islamism and Islam, or political Islam and religious Islam, because involved in this answer are all manner of policy decisions that flow from the differing assumptions that one may have. And a great deal right now is riding in the West, in Europe and to a lesser extent in the United States, on the idea that Islamism is an extraneous element of Islam that can safely be excised, and that Muslim communities in the West will, after this is done, pose no difficulty. A great deal of policy has been built on that assumption. And so, the one thing that has not been done is to examine that assumption itself and to assess whether or not it's true. It would seem to me that should have been done in the first place before the policies were made. But since we're now in an age when first we'll pass the bill and then we'll read it, it perhaps is in line with the prevailing political culture. Now, no one, of course, wants to face this question. No one really wants to ask this question because it appears to involve us in some very ugly implications. If Islamism is an essential or inherent element of Islam, if that is, political Islam is part and parcel of the thing itself, if Islam is inherently political and supremacist, well then many fear that there's nothing that can be done about the growing Muslim communities in the West, and that this will inevitably lead to terrible things like mass deportations, genocide. These things have prevented, these fears have prevented people from looking at this question realistically and squarely. But it is never sound policy to base one's actions on the fear of what may happen if something is true. If the truth is true, then it is what it is, and we have to deal with it. And there are any number of positive steps that can be taken in line with Judeo-Christian values and with the legal tradition of the West that have nothing to do with mass deportation or genocide or any other terrible moral evil. And yet, none of the steps that can be taken that would be realistic and in line with our traditions can be taken unless we face this problem realistically to start with. I remember once I was in a debate about the nature of Islam and the teachings of the Quran and Muhammad about warfare, And my opponent in the debate, after I had made a statement, he said, if what Mr. Spencer is saying is true, it's very discouraging. And based his response on the fact, not that it was false, but just that it was difficult, it was depressing. And it's certainly true that in America especially, we always want solutions. And people generally tend to think that you've failed in an analysis if you cannot provide a way to solve the problem. Some problems are insoluble, I'm sorry to tell you. However, every problem can be managed. And this is a problem that can be managed, but only if it's properly understood. Now, whence Islamism? Islamism, political Islam, was founded not in 1928, but in 622. 622 is the year of the Hijrah, when Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina and became for the first time a political and a military leader. And as if emblematic of how essential this is considered by Muslims, by Islamic tradition in general, to be to Islam itself, the Islamic calendar does not begin with what one might expect as a Westerner. It does not begin with the birth of Muhammad or the death of Muhammad or the first revelation from Allah to Muhammad. The year one of the Islamic calendar is the first year of the Hijrah, of when Islam became for the first time a political and a social system, and not simply an individual religious faith and a matter of one's individual piety. And thus was emphasized the essential character of the political aspects of Islam. Muhammad, according to the Quran, as was mentioned earlier actually, is an excellent example of conduct, al-uswa al-hasana. And when he became, for the first time, a political and military leader, and established Islam as a political system, this is behavior that is considered exemplary for all time, and indeed became codified in Islamic law precisely as such. Now, when one turns to the Quran, one finds traces of these kinds of teachings in it. Most infamously is Surah At-Tawbah, Surah 9 of the Quran, which in its entirety is a manifesto for aggressive warfare against non-believers, most particularly in verse 29 of chapter 9 of the Quran, which is a mandate to wage war particularly against Jews and Christians. And the verse says, "Those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, even among the people of the book," which is the Quranic term for Jews and Christians primarily, "and do not hold as unlawful that which Allah and His Messenger have declared to be unlawful, and do not follow the true religion, fight against them until they pay the jizya," which is a tax, "with willing submission, and feel themselves subdued." So they have to pay this tax, they have to feel themselves subdued. In other words, the Muslims are commanded to fight against non-Muslims, particularly Jews and Christians, until they are subjugated and accept a secondary position in the society. Now, this is one verse out of a big book. And of course, many people will say, well, the Bible has violent passages in it as well. And so we have to look at the entire interpretative tradition that is connected with the book and with the entirety of the book itself. That's completely reasonable. But when we do, the news doesn't get any better. Because there are tolerant and peaceful verses in the Quran. That is certainly true. Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad's earliest biographer, taught that the passages that mandated violence against unbelievers, like the one I just read to you, take precedence because they follow chronologically later in Muhammad's career. They take precedence over the more peaceful and tolerant verses that came earlier. And that, too, became mainstream Islamic theology and was repeated by numerous Islamic scholars and theologians down through the centuries to the present day. All the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, without exception, every last one of them, teaches that it is the responsibility of the Ummah, the Islamic community worldwide, to wage war against unbelievers in order to establish them as subservient under Islamic law, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, this is not saying that all Muslims are terrorists or all Muslims are evil or some such in ways that this argument has been caricatured. There are obviously many Muslims not interested in pursuing this program simply because they have other things to do, they have other priorities in their lives, they have other things on their mind. There is in Islam, as well as in every other religious tradition, among the believers a spectrum of belief, of knowledge, and of fervor. the teachings of the religion are one thing, and the way in which any individual puts it into practice are another. However, if we take that fact as evidence for the existence of a theologically and juridically viable form of Islam that contains no political or supremacist aspects, we're just whistling in the dark. It does not exist. There is no such thing. There are, in other words, peaceful and moderate Muslims, certainly. There is no peaceful or moderate Islam. There is no formulation of Islam that is mainstream or traditional or has any standing within the Islamic world that does not contain this manifesto for warfare and conquest and subjugation. Reformers do exist, and insofar as they are sincere, insofar as they are genuine, and I say that, make that caveat because there are a great many who very slyly use language in ways that most Westerners are not aware of what they're doing. And they're actually making a case for Sharia while appearing to do something quite different. But genuine reformers do exist. However, placing high hopes upon them runs the risk of exalting fringe characters, or these deceivers, who have little or no influence in the Islamic world itself, to the status of spokesman for the Islamic community. And that's actually being done to a tremendous degree, most particularly in the United States and in Great Britain. There are people who have constructed, Islamic groups who have constructed a new Islam, their own private Islam, and have rejected terrorism, although often that term itself is not defined, or if it is defined, it's defined in a very misleading way. And they have no following within the Islamic community as a whole, but they actually have a quite large following among non-Muslims who wish to be reassured and who wish to feel better about this whole problem and wish it weren't quite as bad as it is. And I understand the impulse, but really, if we're going to do anything serious to save Europe at this point, then it seems to me to be absolutely essential in the first place that we be realistic about the nature of the problem itself. For example, in regard to these reformers, there is a group, the Fiqh Council of North America. Fiqh is Islamic jurisprudence. And the Fiqh Council of North America has issued, on several occasions actually, with great fanfare and tremendous enthusiastic press coverage, a condemnation of terrorism. And it sounds great. Muslims condemn terrorism. We have nothing to do with any of this. Read the document, and there is a condemnation of attacks on innocent civilians. Read the Quran, there is no indication anywhere in all its many, many, many denunciations of unbelievers that the unbelievers are innocent. There is no such concept within traditional Islamic teaching. The unbelievers are not in good faith. They never act in good faith. It is actually a very widespread element of Islamic theology that non-Muslims know full well that Islam is true, but they refuse to accept it, and they refuse to become Muslims out of a desire for financial gain, or social status, or some other base motive. There's even a story in Islamic tradition of a delegation of Christians who went to see Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. And along the way, on the way, the leader of this delegation of Christians, he turns to the rest of them and he says, "We know this man is a prophet. We know that he fits all the prophecies about the next prophet in our holy books. However, the Byzantines pay us a good living, and if we acknowledge him as a prophet, they'll cut us off. And so we have to go in and oppose him." And this is not just one isolated story. This is how unbelievers are always presented in Islamic tradition. They know better. I can tell you personally, I get emails all the time from Muslims, very frequently. And they say, "You know Islam is true, and you're just trying to make some money." There's money in this. And I understand where they're coming from, because this is what they are taught. But the point is that there is no innocent non-Muslim in Islamic theology. And so to condemn an attack on innocent civilians does not condemn any terrorist attack as we understand them. It leaves a wide enough loophole to fit 9/11 in. and the July 7th bombings in London, and all the rest of them. So, above all, it is imperative at this time that we avoid fantasy-based policymaking and fantasy-based analysis. The implications of what I'm saying are very bad. I don't mean, there's no way to sugarcoat them, but there are precedents and there are useful ways forward if we have the courage to face this problem as it truly is. This is a problem within Islamic teaching, within core Islamic teaching founded on the Quran. As such, wherever there are Islamic communities, there will be terrorism and efforts to impose elements of Islamic law through peaceful means to assert the precedence of Islamic law over the laws of the state in which the Muslims happen to be residing. That will always happen. Now, 1945, the MacArthur government, the occupational government in Japan, issued an edict saying that Shinto, the religion of the Japanese that had fueled Japanese imperial militarism in World War II, would have no interference from the United States occupying forces as an expression of individual piety, as the religion of any Japanese citizen. No interference whatsoever from the government. However, Shinto would have no role in the government or in the schools. And the distinction was made, it was imposed from without, that Shinto would have no way to express the political militarism that had led to World War II in the first place. Now, the United States, Great Britain, Europe are all facing a very similar problem with growing Muslim communities asserting political and societal notions that are at variance with our ideas of the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of rights of women with men, the equality of rights of all people before the law. If our governments had the courage to stand up and say that any assertion of these political aspects of Islam that are at variance with our existing laws will be considered to be seditious. Under existing sedition laws, there would be a tremendous amount of progress made on this problem. But, of course, we're nowhere near that because we can't even admit that there are such initiatives going on from the Islamic communities as such. And so as long as this unrealism persists, then the difficulties, the cognitive dissonance will continue to grow. And as long as the cognitive dissonance continues to grow, so also will the assertiveness and belligerence of the Islamic communities in the West, because they will see that we are not able and not willing to take the decisive steps necessary to do anything serious to stop them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Robert. To guide us through some more thorny issues.